Khalid Fahmi, I'm the director of the Center for Islamic Studies. Thank you all for coming, and we're delighted tonight to have Heba Moraif, who's the Amnesty International's regional director for the Middle East and North Africa, based in Beirut. It gives me personal pleasure. Heba is an old friend. We haven't seen each other for some years. And to go through Heba's CV is to go through some of the most difficult offices and tasks of any human rights activist in the Middle East, ticking off all the important organizations before Amnesty International. Heba worked in Human Rights Watch, also in charge of the Middle East. She works for the International Crisis Group, and she worked as deputy director of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, which I consider to be the most important human rights organization in Egypt and in the Middle East, and one of the most innovative human rights organizations anywhere in the world, in my mind. I remember Heba in the early months of the revolution in Egypt, leaving Egypt, going to Libya, in the midst of the unraveling of Libya, covering a very, very difficult situation and documenting atrocious, horrific abuses of human rights. And she did the same back in Egypt and then in Tunisia, and now in charge of the entire region. This is a very heavy burden. It requires enormous skills, stamina, concentration, and enormous personal courage. So it is an enormous privilege and honor to have you, Heba, here. And I can't say how inspiring it is for me to follow your activities, and I'm very glad that some of our students are here to watch what it means to be courageous and to translate the amazing information and knowledge you have of the region in, I don't want to use cliches, but just to pointers and to name names and to tell truth to power. So your talk, Heba's talk tonight, is about Tunisia and Egypt, struggles for justice in the aftermath of the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Heba Moraif.
Thanks, Khalid, for the very, very kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here. It's a privilege to also choose what I wanted to speak about, because I had to leave. I left Egypt in late 2016, and which was heartbreaking. And then moved to Tunisia for 2 years. So throughout those 2 years, I spent a lot of my time thinking of the what-ifs to do with Egypt, of what lessons learned we could use in our work on Tunisia. And so in choosing what I wanted to focus on today, I wanted to share with you some of my reflections about the work that we often do as human rights activists, related to calling for accountability, to trying to get the criminal justice systems to function. And I guess I say that because over the last few years, a lot of critiques about the human rights movement or the human rights paradigm have been published. And one of the critiques that's out there is obviously also related to an overemphasis that human rights defenders often place on criminal justice responses or on the legal framework. And I guess the line of critique there says, that is not the core of a struggle, or that some almost misses the core political struggle that's often out there. And I think what I wanted to talk about, at least in terms of the kinds of work that human rights communities in both Egypt and Tunisia have focused on, in particular in the post-2011 moment, I wanted to argue that, in fact, when you try to fight within the criminal justice system or think about what mechanisms out there could be used for accountability, it's often really at the core of a political struggle in a moment of transition, such as those that we had in Egypt and Tunisia. I think Egyptians have had a lot of time to reflect on the questions of what went wrong, and I think one of the questions we maybe don't spend enough time asking ourselves, because the post-2013 moment is so overwhelming in terms of its darkness, is whether there were moments along the road in 2011 and 12 where we had a lot more agency, where we could have made different choices, at least when it comes to the struggles around justice. I don't really have a lot of answers for that, but I wanted to maybe talk you through some of those choices or some of those moments along the way, and thought that maybe towards the end we could reflect on that together. For me, when it comes to when it comes to the work of human rights defenders in Egypt under Mubarak, a lot of our work was often framed under the exceptionalism that Mubarak created with his police state, the emergency law as the alternative to the regular justice system, administrative detention, thousands, 1990s onwards, detained indefinitely without judicial order, without proper judicial review, under the emergency law. And so in a sense, when the January 2011 protests came around, one of the main asks was an end to the state of emergency, which is actually a pretty technical demand. I mean, it's not something that you think street protesters are going to be out there calling for, because it's a whole set of rules that give the executive much more discretion and that kind of limit judicial oversight. And I think the reason that became one of the main asks, and I don't know if any of you were in Egypt at the time of the January 2011 protests, but those of you, I think Ahmed and Khaled at least were in the square at the time and would remember that there was this long banner that hung from one of the buildings and sort of had the main demands of protesters at the time, and one of them was an end to the state of emergency. And I think the reason that was the case was because Mubarak had always gone around the judiciary, which he perceived as one of the an institution that wasn't completely under his control. There were judges who would carry out some of the worst political rulings, but relatively speaking, there were also a lot of judges who wanted to stay out of politics and just do their thing in applying the law. And that meant that human rights lawyers working under Mubarak at the time, like Ahmed, could go to prosecutors and actually get people released on procedural grounds if judges were not respecting all of the procedural guarantees. Another of the demands that was on that long banner was accountability, because another of I think the struggles that the human rights community in Egypt really rallied around was to try to get any prosecutions for torture, which was systematic at the time under Mubarak. I think another example of where human rights demands or human rights framing or human rights agenda can actually became a central call of a lot of the protests was a lot of the work that happened around and calling for an end to military trials throughout 2011. There was a campaign and sort of various groupings of activist groups called the No to Military Trials group. And I think that's another interesting one, because again, it's not something that springs to mind immediately why military trials are problematic versus civilian trials. It's again quite technical. It depends on the composition of the military justice system. There are some that are worse than others. Obviously, from a human rights perspective, we're against all trials of civilians before military trials. But the reason I bring that up is because here again, you had the uprising, you had that great moment of victory with Mubarak's departure, but the day after that, you had the military writing the rules of the roadmap and the transition. So in a sense, something that seemed fairly tangential, like rallying around an end to military trials, was actually very much at the center of military rule and a desire to return again to the proper functioning criminal justice system and the civilian judiciary. So in a sense, keeping all that in mind, it's not surprising that calls for justice for the killing of protesters in January 2011 revolved around trying to get the regular criminal justice system to actually investigate. I think because of the heritage of special courts, meaning either military trials or emergency state security courts, which are the trials that were always used to punish either Muslim Brotherhood, opposition members, or activists. The idea of exceptionalism or a special justice system seemed dangerous at the time. And so, in a sense, when when prosecutors started investigating the killings of protesters in early 2011, and to me at the time, that seemed like the best possible way to go, the least likely to involve executive interference. Prosecutors actually started investigating quite early on, but not early enough. So the first example of investigations, just looking at the documents that they had at the time that I have, was from February 16th onwards. Mubarak had fallen February 11th. And that's significant because, to be honest, the killings of protesters had more or less ended after the first 5 days. I mean, up until, let's say, January 31st. But then things were pretty stable. So actually a prosecutor, we were bouncing around the square and doing interviews, and things were completely normal in Cairo at the time, but prosecutors hadn't actually started to investigate the killings properly at the time, which also then gave the Ministry of Interior the time to destroy a lot of the evidence that prosecutors should have been demanding at the time. There's actually a separate case that went to court on the destruction of documents within the state security investigations offices, which again is where a lot of the evidence around the worst abuses was lost. So, in approaching how to investigate the killing of at least 846 protesters at the time, and this was an official number. Prosecutors then were under significant public pressure because the idea that unarmed innocent protesters had been shot by the police, and their families had a lot of were on the media a lot, were speaking out and calling for justice. So there was this great pressure to move forward with these investigations and go to trial quickly. And I think that's another of the challenges that we always face, is that when you have these moments of demand for accountability, sometimes that ends up speeding up the processes and meaning that you're actually not ready to go to trial by the time you push forward with these indictments. So what we ended up with were 38 different trials involving 172 police officers from around the country, and then the one big policy trial. And one of the problems with the way that prosecutors approached this is that they divided up what had happened in those first few days in those first few days of the uprising, when most of the killings happened, into police station cases, and then the square, as one big trial, which is the trial where Mubarak was put on trial. And so of the 38 trials, we ended up with 28 acquittals and only 6 convictions. And they were divided up by police station, by neighborhood. I remember talking to a lot of the families of some of the victims, because I'd been trying to document both the killings and then speak to families about the process a lot. And then when Mubarak went to trial, Mubarak and the Minister of Interior and the heads of the different security agencies, I remember this one woman telling me that she didn't really care that much about that, because it was the local Maadi police station who'd shot her son, and she still lived in that neighborhood, and she still saw them going to work every day. So I think sometimes, at least the media story that was told was mainly the Mubarak trial, the big trial, but not so much these other trials. And the reason we ended up with 28 acquittals, the formal reasons for the dismissals, for the acquittals, were twofold: either lack of evidence or self-defense. And this was a design problem, because prosecutors chose to divide it up into police station versus non-police station cases. There was this prima facie assumption that the protesters were coming to attack a police station. And looking through the court records, and if any of you are ever really interested in this, there are such interesting political stories to be told. Just reading, seeing how judges read out their verdicts, and how politicized they were in their perception of what happened during those protests in 2011. We do, however, have 6 convictions, 4 of which were suspended sentences. So the judge ends up saying, yes, police officers did kill protesters in this neighborhood. However, they were really young, and so we're going to apply clemency so that we don't destroy their careers, right? But again, interesting in terms of actually confirming that this took place. And then there were two actual sentences where 2 police officers were convicted and actually served time initially, although it was subsequently overturned on appeal. So really drops in the ocean overall, but sometimes when I compare it to Tunisia, I still think that this is an important initial record of some of the prosecutions that took place at the time. I think one of the major problems that maybe we didn't realize is, a prosecutor who's never investigated the use of live ammo by security officials before doesn't even know how to investigate it, doesn't even know what kind of evidence they're meant to obtain from the MOI. It was only several months later that they started then talking about the logbooks that they had asked for and were not obtaining, and then didn't pursue MOI officials who refused to cooperate to provide that evidence at the time. The Ministry of Interior in Cairo. So apologies for the acronyms. I think the reason the big Mubarak trial was still very important for us, and I remember for a number of months Mubarak was still sitting in his villa in Sharm el-Sheikh, as far as any of us could tell, and there'd be a protest every week or so talking about, where is Mubarak and when will there be accountability for him. So it wasn't until May that he actually started being investigated in 2011. And for a long time it seemed like the military, and he'd been their commander-in-chief, was still trying to shield him. But successive protests of people calling for him to be actually held accountable built up to a moment where he was investigated and he was indicted. And then his trial opened in the summer. And I remember we literally didn't know up until the last minute whether he would appear in court. And I remember the day before he appeared in court, I got this phone call from one of his daughters-in-law, who kind of called me and said, I'm in the bathroom in the hospital and they're coming to take him away, and he's really unwell, and this is against his human rights. And I sort of tried to talk her through it and say, well, if health is a concern, then his defense lawyer will need to raise that tomorrow in court. But a human rights organization is not going to be able to prevent Mubarak being moved from Sharm el-Sheikh to Cairo tomorrow for the court hearing. And then I said, look, in any case, realistically, the only body that could prevent that from happening right now is the military. And I remember her saying, yeah, they're not taking our calls. And I remember being just incredibly excited, because it felt that, as an Egyptian and as someone who was a human rights person, this seemed like, we hadn't fully won, because the military was still writing the roadmap and they were still in control. But with this one trial, we'd have a normal trial, not exceptional, not a Gaddafi killing, not a Ben Ali in Saudi Arabia, but actually a proper trial where we'd have this record. The trial ends up with an initial conviction for Mubarak, but the judge chickens out and ends up convicting him not for ordering, but for failing to protect protesters who were attacked in the squares, and doesn't actually identify who shot protesters that day. And that becomes crucial, because then later on when it goes to cassation, it gets overturned. So in a sense, we don't have a strong reasoning in that verdict there to help us in this moment that we're in, because a lot of what I'm talking about is related to the question of what we have on record in terms of at times since the history of the 2011 to 2013 moment is now being completely rewritten. Apart from those sets of trials, there was one other exception that I throw out there, is that in November 2011, the Mohammed Mahmoud protests took place, which were again police protester protests, and there's a video of this one police officer who ends up shooting one of the protesters and actually shooting him in the eye. And there's this clip of him where you can hear one of his other police officers saying, "Nice work, you got him in the eye." And that was again one of the rare prosecutions that actually went forward and resulted in a 3-year conviction. It's kind of referred to as the Gada Abesha case. But for the most part, it was actually very difficult to move, apart from that first round of investigations that went to trial under immense public pressure, it was actually pretty difficult to move other investigations through the system successfully. I throw out another couple of examples. I wanted to talk about military impunity, because it feels like we're in such a different era in Egypt today, that the fact that there were actually a couple of cases where military officers were put on trial for human rights violations in 2011 seems really like ancient history. But in March 2011, the military had cleared, there was a sort of a leftover small sit-in in Tahrir, and the military then went in and cleared that and arrested over 100 protesters and put most of them on trial in military trials. The protesters included 7 women. And when they took the women to the military prison, they then subjected them to forced virginity tests, which basically amounts to sexual assault. And I remember meeting a couple of the women just after their release from military, and we just couldn't get our head around how this had happened. I mean, it's not like we had very much experience with the military arresting women in general in Egypt, because they'd never really been deployed. But we couldn't understand what the thinking was around that, what the motivation was around that. And I think those women are some of the bravest women that we know, because one of them, Samira Ibrahim, who later actually ended up filing a complaint against the military, actually was willing to go public at the time, and she's from a pretty conservative family in Upper Egypt, and what appeared to be the motivation, or at least when later on CNN managed to get a military officer on record anonymously saying, well, those women were not like your daughter or mine, and they were, they were conducting illicit full sexual relations in the tents in the square, and so we had to conduct virginity tests to determine whether they were respectable or not. So that was actually on record. And I remember when I first went to a meeting with the SCAF was in June 2011. I mean, the SCAF was the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces, and so we met one of them at the time by Human Rights Watch hat. And they tried to brush it off as a very regular procedure that they do whenever they arrest women, but they think they hadn't quite realized how shocking this would be in terms of the international coverage around it, and so in a sense, pressure around that actually did result in a prosecution. It was an unsuccessful prosecution, because what happened is that this one military doctor was put on trial again in front of a military tribunal. But the fact that these 2 young women could go and testify in front of a military court, and actually because I'd had that conversation with the military general, I went with them to the military court to testify to that conversation with the military general, saying, yes, this is just a regular procedure, I think was incredibly significant. I mean, it just seems like a different era to us right now. We also had a decision by the Council of State at the time, which is a civilian court that oversees executive acts, ruling that this was a violation of human rights law, and unhelpfully adding the Geneva Conventions, which don't even apply. But the point is, you had a civilian court brave enough to be able to say to the military at a time when the military was ruling the country that this had been a violation. So an attempt, at least a bit of an investigation into sexual violence, unsuccessful in the end because the military officer was acquitted. The other example is that I don't know if you were following Egypt at the time. There was a protest of Coptic protesters in front of Maspero in Cairo in October 2011, where 27 Coptic protesters were killed, 13 of them crushed by military APCs, and 14 killed by live ammo. The breakdown is from the Forensic Medical Authority. But this is the other example where it actually resulted in a prosecution, and 3 very low-level military, it was actually the people driving the APCs at the time, but they were prosecuted by military tribunals and sentenced to 2 and 3 years. Again, drops in the ocean, but we have that on record. The other records that we have, and I'll stop talking about Egypt in a second, but that we have to build on are the fact-finding committee reports, because in April 2011, the first fact-finding committee report was published, which confirmed that the security services, and especially the Central Security Forces, had shot these 846 protesters. That's where the number came from. The second fact-finding committee that we had, have and don't have, was set up in September 2012. At this time, the Muslim Brotherhood were in power. So Morsi had won the elections, really, and the second round of the elections was a week after the first Mubarak verdict had come in, and that was seen as a really weak conviction. And so he used that in part of his speeches, and had set up this fact-finding committee right after he took over. And the interesting thing about that is that it looked at 1.5 years of abuses by the military and by the police at the time. And we know some of the people who were on that committee. And I know from one of the committee members that because it was a sort of a presidentially sanctioned fact-finding committee, he said that they had a number of military generals who'd come before the committee and would sort of say, yep, and then we did this, and then, to keep their morale high, we told them that they could use whatever means they needed. And so actually there's a lot of testimony that was out there in that fact-finding committee report that I think, should we ever have an official version released, will be incredibly important in terms of longer-term accountability. The problem with it, is that the report was never formally released. They finished their mandate at the end of December 2012, and at that point, the Muslim Brotherhood had already, there was a moment of significant overreach by Morsi with a constitutional declaration in November 2012, and there was already a significant political crisis at that moment. So in a sense, the Morsi government actually ended up burying the fact-finding committee report. We tried to get our friend on the committee to leak it because he was from the human rights community, and he was very insistent that there was no value in him leaking the whole report, that it had to be issued officially. And I guess I put this out there because, again, after the summer of 2013 and the massacres of 2013, we forget all of these details. But it was very significant, and I think a historic error on the part of the Morsi government to bury a fact-finding committee report at a moment when they actually they'd created it in order to put that out there and hold both Ministry of Interior and military officers to account. Fast forward, obviously, Rabaa happens, over 900 killed in that one day, and not only is there no accountability, but in fact, you have a trial of 737 protesters who are then prosecuted for having participated in the protests on the day itself. So completely surreal in terms of contrast. The same actually for the Al-Fatih protests on the 16th of August, where you had at least 120 killed, 120 protesters killed, and then what ends up happening, the only trial that ends up happening is a trial of 494 protesters for participating in an unauthorized process with accusations of violence being put to the protesters. I think for me, in a sense, the main question for me is whether a reliance on the existing legal system, which while it may have been some independent to a certain extent, was ultimately a legal system designed to criminalize dissent in many ways. If you look at the whole set of provisions on expression or provisions on trying to undermine the government, it almost criminalizes everything to do with those uprisings of January 2011. So for me, the main question is whether, had there been a moment of trying to create an alternative mechanism for accountability, whether we could have fared somewhat better in terms of outcomes. This is what brings me to Tunisia, right? I mean, and in many ways we can't compare the transition processes because Tunisia never had the military writing the rules, writing the roadmap, writing the constitutional declaration from day one. Tunisia, I think we would all agree, had a more solid process in terms of also starting with the National Constituent Assembly and taking their time around creating the constitution and before moving straight into the contentious nature of ideology, of identity politics, which is, I think, where Tunisia is actually stuck today. So I think they were already ahead of Egypt in that sense by starting with the constitutional process first. Tunisia obviously also had far less casualties because they didn't have. They had only 132 protesters who'd been killed between December 17th and January 14th. And at the time, ironically, when there was a move towards accountability, they actually ended up using military trials for a lot of the prosecutions at the time. And I remember having a conversation in 2011 with Sihem bin Tidreen, who ran one of the few human rights organizations that could exist under Ben Ali, and later became the president of the Truth Commission. And she was saying, no, for us, the military system, military judges are much less corrupt than civilian judges, so we trust them more. Which, in my view, is always a strategic mistake. So the military trials resulted in either absentia sentences or lower sentences, light sentences that were subsequently overturned, and did not involve insisting on security officers who hadn't responded to summons actually attending the trials, and so hardly any of them actually ended up serving time as a result of that. In parallel to that, however, you had the Constituent Assembly creating the Truth Commission, right? So the Tunisian IVD, the Instance Vérité et Dignité, was created in December 2013 by a law. It's not actually a constitutional body because Tunisia has a number of constitutional oversight bodies, but by a law created by the Constituent Assembly. And I think this is a particularly interesting moment to be paying attention to Tunisia and to the Truth Commission because it has just come to the end of its mandate. And the reason I think the Truth Commission is incredibly important, it's not just because those first rounds of prosecutions of the killings related to the revolution in Tunisia were ineffective, but more than that, because the IVD actually ended up hearing or documenting and investigating 62,000 cases. And they had offices around the country, and they had people coming forward and telling the stories of their lives under Ben Ali, but not only Ben Ali, but also Bourguiba and going further back, because the temporal scope of the IVD is back to 1954. I think so it was a very serious operation, and because we were based in Tunisia at the time, we would go and we would speak to a lot of their investigators. And the reason the IVD, I think, is quite historic for our region is that with the exception of Morocco, the Truth Commission did not have the power to make referrals directly to court. So you didn't actually end up with any prosecutions in Morocco, whereas the IVD has that power. Technically, what happens is that the IVD, once they've investigated a case, they refer it technically to the office of the prosecutor, and then the prosecutor does an automatic referral to trial. But they pretty much have the ability to indict directly, which has been controversial in some ways in Tunisia. The biggest shortcoming of the IVD is that the Ministry of Interior, the Tunisian Ministry of Interior and the Military Justice System pretty much refused to cooperate. the EVD would send requests for information, subpoenas, and there was just a general non-responsiveness. And one mistake I think the EVD made was to not pursue that, not to escalate that, because the law actually gives them the right to file criminal complaints against any state officials who don't cooperate in providing evidence to the Truth Commission. So now we are at a point where there are 20 trials before the different Tunisian courts that have started as a result of referrals, 72 direct referrals overall, and then 64 cases of investigations where the Truth Commission didn't finish its investigations, but because its mandate was ending, it hasn't yet gone to trial. But a prosecutor or an investigative judge with the political will to pursue that could actually then complete the investigations and refer to trial themselves. And the reason this is so incredibly significant is that Ben Ali really destroyed the judiciary, or I mean, maybe it wasn't a strong enough judiciary to start with, but Ben Ali didn't even give the judiciary in Tunisia the space, the relative space that it had in Egypt. And it's a pretty much dysfunctional legal system as it is right now. The statistic that I like to throw out just to shock people is that in Sisi's Egypt today, there are more torture prosecutions or prosecutions of police officers low level for torture and other forms of abuse than there's been in Tunisia in the post-2011 moment. And what basically ends up happening is that if you file a torture complaint, it gets investigated by an investigative judge, and that's where it gets stuck. It doesn't go past that. There have been cases where judges have been threatened by security unions. There have been cases where judges have said that they feel they can't afford the backlash to actually refer. So the system is a little bit broken. And I think the note, I mean, the reason I'm taking you through all of this detail is that Tunisia is almost, I feel like Tunisia, because it's the only semi-good story we have from the Arab Spring, sometimes suffers from being seen as a success with not enough attention to what isn't working. And I would argue that a lack of emphasis on getting the criminal justice system to function, on getting the Ministry of Interior to feel that they are not back in business, which has particularly been the case in the last couple of years with rounds of attacks against Tunisian security services. There's been a sense of a re-empowerment, not to Ben Ali level, because under Ben Ali they were ruled by fear. So people wouldn't dare to even gossip at a coffee shop in Tunis about Ministry of Interior officials, which was never the case in Mubarak's Egypt. But he ran an extremely, extremely tight ship in Tunisia. So we're not back to that moment. There is still that area of political space. You can still have demonstrations in the capital in Tunis without any violence occurring. But at the end of the day, as long as a Ministry of Interior official knows that they don't need to fear that a judge will ever hold them responsible, we're still seeing the use of torture as part of regular interrogations. We're still seeing house raids. We're still seeing a lot of these abuses happening, not at the same scale, but in particular anything related to suspected Islamists or families of suspected jihadists, and that's where you get a lot of the worst abuses happening. So I guess I'm trying to conclude maybe on the note, at least for Tunisia, that the political space that you have right now, that I think Tunisians have embraced, that Tunisian civil society has embraced, remains vulnerable as long as you don't have the fundamental balance of power between the judiciary and the police overturned. Because very often coming out of a police state, that is really the core of the struggle that I think, whether it's legal practitioners or human rights people, you're just trying to overturn that. You want a Ministry of Interior official to fear the idea of justice and oversight. So I would watch the space when it comes to the transitional justice trials in Tunisia, because I think the way those trials go will tell us a lot about maybe about the direction which the Tunisian transition is likely to take in the next few years. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Heba, very much. I think you are ready to receive some questions.
Sure.
Just ask people to speak up. The mic will pick them up from here if I enhance.
You want to move the mic itself?
No, that'll be fine. We'll just do it that way around.
Okay. Those who do ask questions, if you can speak up, please. Khaled? Speak up.
You mentioned twice evidence from the Ministry of Interior. The first time that they had destroyed evidence. The second time that there were certain logbooks. I want to know what kind of evidence exactly are you talking about? Logbooks for ammunition? Is there some other sort of evidence that they keep for things like this? And is there any precedence of the Ministry of Interior giving evidence like that to lawyers or prosecution before that?
Well, before that, no, because the only shootings the only use of live ammunition by the Ministry of Interior, I think, was in 2005 when there was a sit-in of Sudanese refugees in Cairo, and they kind of cleared that, ended up killing 25 of the Sudanese refugees, and then sometimes in election-related violence. But we collectively, and Ahmed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think lawyers were ever in a position to be able to identify exactly what kind of documentation on the MOI side was being requested. So you'd actually start from the other end, because you'd feel that you'd never get anything out of the MOI. You'd go to the Forensic Medical Authority, and if you could get a medical report at least proving death by live ammunition, you'd then take that to the prosecutor and try and get the prosecutor to demand that from the MOI. But in terms of demanding evidence, I don't think there was ever an expectation in the pre-2011 moment that the MOI would actually ever open its doors. In the post-2011 moment, I mean, for a while the MOI was a little bit, there was a bit of a vacuum. And I think the prosecutors did manage to get some of the requested documents from the MOI, but not the, what's the taslih logbooks? I mean, not what kind of weapons were authorized on the day, because there are order sheets for that. And then there are other examples of, at one point they requested the Egyptian Museum surveillance cameras, right, from the General Intelligence Agency. And the General Intelligence Agency responded saying, "Yeah, sorry, we checked, and all the videotapes have been taped over." So there was a lot of very deliberate limiting of any official documentations that were handed over in the context of that trial. The second thing that I mentioned is kind of unrelated, because the state security, because in a sense it was the central security forces who were doing most of the shootings that day, or who are the ones who are given the arms to actually go out and deploy, because they're the ones responsible for crowd control. But separately, if we'd wanted to look into the the systematic torture, the disappearances, and the long-term detention at state security offices, that's where it was the state security documents that would have been crucial. And of course, there are a few moments where, I think it was in early March, where, no, it must have been in February, where actually protesters did go into offices of state security in early March, 5th of March, in Cairo and in Alexandria. And a lot of people managed to go and find from at least the surveillance units the files that they had on themselves. But we didn't manage nobody, to my knowledge, and I spent a lot of time actually trying to find out informally from the people who went in and actually got documents or scanned them. We didn't find anything specific to torture or disappearance that could have been used to action at that time.
Hi, thank you very much. I have 3 questions. The first, if you could talk a little bit about, because in Tunisia, Ben Ali, part of the trial was the confiscation of the assets, and that's one of the big things that's happening right now. So how did that play out in Egypt in terms of not just looking at the killing of the protesters, but also all of the assets of both him and the party, etc.? And then the second the second and third is related specifically to Tunisia. My understanding is that they still haven't set up a constitutional court, and that's one of the big. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. And then the third question is related to the final list of the martyrs. So I study urban change in Tunis, and one of the things that we're looking out for is when will the Martyrs Memorial be built? And they say that that cannot be built until the official list is put out. Who would actually put out that list? Would it be the EBD or another one?
So just to take your last question first, as you know, the EBD finalized its report, right, at the end of December. And its report is meant to include measures to do with reparation as well. And so in addition to, I spoke mostly about the referrals to trial, but there's this whole, the importance of the report is to set out recommendations for non-repetition and for the kind of institutional reform that will guarantee non-repetition, but also measures around reparation. So my expectation, and I haven't sadly been able to get a leaked version of the report, but my expectation is that recommendations around memorialization will also be included in that report. The main challenge right now is that as required by law, the president of the EVD requested meetings with the president, with President Sipsi, with Prime Minister Shahid, and with the Speaker of Parliament in December, and this happened on December 21st. And to date, the Prime Minister has refused to respond to the request to meet in order to receive the report. President Sipsi did respond, and so she met him. Sihem bin Sidrine managed to meet him along with two of the other commissioners just before the end of her mandate. So officially she has handed it over to the government, but she thinks it's actually probably a lack of coordination between the presidency and the Prime Minister's office in that sense, because because I was in Tunis last month, and when we followed up with the Minister for Human Rights saying, why is the government refusing to receive the report, he was extremely aggressive about this, saying, we're not refusing to receive the report in the least, we just need to have, we need to be prepared in order to receive the report. And so we said, yes, but once you receive the report, you then have to take a number of measures in implementation of the report. And he kind of kept pushing back around that. And I mean, it's a longer story, but I think the politics of the EVD, and some of it is also somewhat personalized around Sihem bin Sidrine, as you may know, because it's become she's become sort of a flashpoint around that. And for me, regardless of whether Sihem bin Sidrine has done a good job or not, I mean, it's really not a question of the personal, right? It's a question of protection of the institution. The other problem related to that is that a lot of the victims who went to the EVD have expectations around compensation. So this is where the list of martyrs becomes an incredibly controversial issue. And the EVD has made recommendations also around that. But here again, the government has refused to give them a budget, right? They haven't received the budget since 2017. So I also worry that in the government's, I think at this point it's clear that the Tunisian government has not only not been supportive of the EVD, but at certain points is actually trying to undermine it. And I'm not sure that there's going to be a budget forthcoming for compensation. And I worry that that in turn will actually undermine the EVD, the trust that victims had in the EVD and in the idea of transitional justice. The Supreme Constitutional Court, I think, is hugely important, and here you have the political failings of a parliament that's been controlled for the most part by Nida and Nahda and the dysfunction of Nida in and of itself being part of that, because there have been a number of moments where parliament could have and should have voted to appoint the missing Supreme Constitutional Court members so that the court could actually start operating. I do worry, however, that there's, I think it will be incredibly important to have that court, because there are a lot of strong provisions in the Tunisian constitution, but it will take forever for cases to reach the Constitutional Court, for cases to be ruled on. So I also feel that one of the other things that needs to happen in parallel with the Supreme Constitutional Court is to actually have the administrative court structure decentralized. Because right now, if you ever want to challenge an administrative decision, we've done a lot of work on travel bans, on house arrests, on administrative decisions that the Ministry of Interior in Tunis takes. Right now, there's only one court in the country where you can go and appeal. And so there's very little oversight over the executive. And in parallel with the plans for the Supreme Constitutional Court, there is a plan to decentralize the administrative court, to have them around the country, and that also hasn't happened yet.
Yes, please.
Yes, can you give us some idea, please, Eva, of the structure of your office? How many people you have, what expertise they have in things like law, and how the outside helpers feed into this, whether you have a structure of volunteers actually seeking out information to feed into your office, or whether it's all more informal than that?
So for the Middle East and North Africa
Yes.
office, we, up until about 4 years ago, we used to be based in London, and then Amnesty decided to decentralize its international secretariat. And so now we're based in, we have 34 people based in Beirut and about 16 based in Tunis, and our office in Jerusalem will have 6 people in it when recruitment is complete. Our teams, we're designed around country teams, so I keep pointing to Ahmed because he used to be our Egypt researcher, our lead Egypt researcher, and he is a human rights lawyer, so depending on people's backgrounds, sometimes they're lawyers, sometimes they're journalists, but they come to us with country expertise, and then we try to reflect on how, through our reporting and our campaigns, we can be most helpful, I think, to human rights communities in the countries themselves. Because we're based in Tunisia and Lebanon, it's easy because you're part of the human rights community there, and so you can work with them on a regular basis and think how to use the fact that Amnesty has a lot of different offices in Europe as well. And then it's more challenging with Egypt because we don't do field work in Egypt right now for security reasons.
And Libya?
Libya, Libya is challenging not because of targeting, but rather because of the general security situation and risk of scuffles between militias breaking out at any point. We've been trying to get a visa to go back now for the last year and a half, and we've been a little bit stuck in terms of when you have a dysfunctional government, it's been very difficult to figure out who can actually make the decision to give us authorization to go back. A lot of our work on Libya has been focusing on migration recently, on the detention centers for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Libya, because that's such a huge issue to do with European-Libyan relations. And so we've been able to do some of that work either in Tunisia or in Italy, which is where the migrants end up going to do the gathering of testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one question. An awful question, I suppose, in one sense. What's the current score between Egypt and Tunisia in terms of successful prosecutions, even if overturned? Given that, as you say, Tunisia is seen as the good example and Egypt seen as a bad example, in terms of actual people who've gone to prison and at least found guilty. What are the relative numbers? I'm just thinking since 2011.
Oh God, no! That number I don't have, and I think, obviously, Tunisia is. I have way more hope, and I have a lot of hope for Tunisia still. So I'm not comparing them in the absolute. I think I was just trying to compare when it comes to the prosecution of police officers. Even under Mubarak, between 2006 and 2010, there were 6 successful torture prosecutions. And I say this because Egypt had its UPR in 2010, so they actually did a little bit of gathering of statistics to, very proudly present that, which is a drop in the ocean if given systematic torture. But it does at least mean that every now and then, when there's enough public pressure, when there's a video, a famous case of Ahmed al-Kibir 2005, where there was actually a video of him being tortured, and that caused public outcry, and so it went to trial. So at least the system, with pressure, the system would sort of work. I think my concern with Tunisia is that the system was pretty dysfunctional to start with. So even with the broader political will, it's been very easy for police unions, which, we all love unions, but police unions in Tunisia, there's an incident in Ben Arous a few months ago where a judge was investigating a police officer on torture. I mean, at the investigative stage, investigative judge was investigating a police officer, and two of the unions put out a call to protest outside the courthouse, and the judge freaked out and released the... So, I mean, that's the dynamic that we're still stuck in. And while... this is what makes me worry about not having institutions to protect the gains, the political gains you have in Tunisia. Because if the economy tanks, if there are not a round of attacks on tourist destinations, if the political, the political space that you have isn't actually protected right now by enough institutional reform to sustain it. I mean, I really just say this because we spent a lot of your time in Tunisia speaking to, Western governments and donors who are not interested in the issue of accountability for abuses, because in the post-2015 moment, it was all about consolidation. Post-Sousa, post-Ben Girden, the West, in its discussions with the Ministry of Interior, shifted from, are you going to reform, what about security sector reform, to consolidate because you need to, highest exporter of jihadists, you need to get your act together. And so the conversation about reform stalled completely, to the point where, the US does a lot of security training. It doesn't even have a human rights component. You go to the 4th of July reception at the US Embassy and the ambassador says, let's clap for the security services. And I worry about the inability to have a slightly more nuanced assistance policy where you can have security sector reform, talk about accountability, and still actually support the country in its counterterrorism efforts.
Yes. Would you mind commenting on the international pressure on amnesty and how, if it exists, I assume it does, sort of foreign governments influence how you interpret things, how you're allowed to publicly express things, whether, reports you release can be entirely objective or not?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I mean, on the objective side, I can tell you that, reports are the product of maybe 5 or 6 people. There's the author, and then there's probably 3 reviewers, and so I'm not sure I believe in complete objectivity, because any report is, and we're impartial, but we try to be as impartial as possible in our reporting, but we are aligned. We do want to help victims. So we're not political analysts who take a step back and say, this is a situation, there's this person. We are designed to identify who's responsible for a violation. So there's an inbuilt subjectivity in that sense, because our agenda is to actually find a government official who is responsible and who can change it. So that's structurally inbuilt. In terms of government pressure, I mean, I think the only pressure we tend to think about are what the repercussions could be for us from a security perspective sometimes. We haven't had that problem thus far, being based in Tunisia and in Lebanon. But I would say that when we are publishing something on Tunisia or on the Ministry of Interior or in Lebanon, we do, we try to make sure that our offices are like 1,000% compliant, that we've paid every random tax about, literally, and that we're very compliant with everything to do with local law. But I'm not sure, maybe I haven't understood your question quite.
No, it's getting there. I mean, it's just touching on the previous question about how, especially in setting of international donors, whether that shapes the direction in which you take your work.
So I think we're incredibly lucky that we're not funded by governments, that we don't take government funding, and that's a privilege. And I think the fact that I know that I can, I think it becomes more difficult with bigger NGOs or especially humanitarian NGOs or development NGOs who have that relationship with government agencies. But the fact that we're funded by our membership internationally, I think, gives us that kind of independence. So you never feel that there's a relationship of dependency in speaking to particular governments. We obviously have a lot of our national chapters, our sections that are mostly responsible for the bilateral relationships. So I'm from the International Secretariat, but there's also an Amnesty UK, and they're the ones who tend to maintain the relationship with the UK government, for example, including on their foreign policy. So there may be complicated conversations that I'm not aware of, complicated pressures, but for the most part, I think the model, because of funding coming from its members, because we then register under, we don't operate informally, we try and do it very, very legally. I think that does protect us from worrying about, we don't really take, I would say we don't take those governments into account in our work itself. We do, however, think about how we can have an impact on them, and I think we do a whole range from the public stuff and the naming and shaming, which I still think has currency and still has to be part of our work, but we also do a lot of private advocacy, a lot of the time, where we might go in there and say, these are the practical steps that we think you need to take in order to change things. And our tone tends to be a little bit different in those meetings.
Can I? No, there are other questions.
I understand that one of the a criticism of the original Declaration of Human Rights was that it was based on a Judeo-Christian Western view of the world, and that I think there were only 1 or 2 Islamic countries that signed up originally. I think Turkey was one, but it was secular at the time. But since then, there's been the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights for Islam in '94 and 2000. Does Amnesty work from the original Universal Declaration, or are you working from the Cairo Declaration as well?
I want to build on this question at the same time. Yeah, I want just to bridge the two worlds of academia and human rights. So my question is not focusing on Egypt or Tunisia, but on Amnesty itself. For example, some academics have been saying that the Egyptian human rights community, with the Tunisian, with the Libyan, using the language of international human rights, are applying Western agenda or a way or another. And they use the same description when speaking about human rights or Amnesty. I disagree with such a view, but I want to hear your view on this. What do you think are really human rights defenders in these countries applying Western agenda? Two questions, okay? These are 2 separate questions, so please do answer them if you can.
Okay, or the bits of them that I can. So in a sense, the Universal Declaration was a declaration that wasn't binding in '48, but then it was followed by the 2 covenants. So in a sense, we actually, it's the ratification of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic and Social Rights that we tend to cite the most, because, first of all, not all governments have signed on to both of them, and a lot of them have entered reservations. So I think that's the starting point when you're trying to hold the government responsible, is what they've actually signed up to, and they're more detailed when it comes to the Universal Declaration. So we don't look at we wouldn't look at the Cairo Declaration as such, but I do think that the areas where it's important to think about, especially when you're working with Muslim countries, when it's important to start thinking about the relationship between, let's say, Sharia and human rights, is when you're working on personal status laws, and when you're working on some issues to do with women's rights. And I say that because, again, if you want to have if you want to really engage in a conversation and have impact in looking at the legislative reforms, I don't think you're going to change the standards. As a human rights organization, you always ask for the maximum protection that the human rights standard can offer. That's your job. Your job is to never go below that. But along the route to that ask are often a lot of different steps and techniques, and I do think it's important for international organizations to be able to engage in an informed manner in discussions around legislative reform that could also be looking at progressive interpretations of Sharia. I mean, I think there are lots of feminist organizations, including organizations like Musawah, that I find really interesting in terms of tactics, because these discussions, it's not just specific to the Arab world, right? It's specific to any Muslim countries that have ended up using rules from Sharia in their local legislation. And I think if you as a human rights organization just come in and use the international framework, you'll have the discussion at one level, and that should remain your ask, but you can't engage in the different standards where you might be able to get incremental change along the way. The problem there is that most international organizations don't really have the in-house expertise for on Islamic law overall, and there's an article actually about how Amnesty and Human Rights Watch don't do enough on Islamic law that Naz wrote once, I think. In terms of your question, Ahmad, I feel like I spent a lot of the 2000s having that discussion. And I feel like, in a sense, the post-2011 moment was wonderful in the sense that it shut down that discussion for a while. Partly because rights discourse became normalized, partly because I think there was a younger generation of activists who would claim a lot of the political rights, and partly because the standard government line of trying to delegitimize the rights framework as Western resonated less. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a legitimate critique, but I am saying that is not a legitimate critique, but I think the areas where a lot of work needs to happen is not so much on the cultural origins of the rights themselves, but how we can best protect them in different contexts. Now, I think sometimes this discourse is also attached to perception that a Western human rights framework overemphasizes civil and political rights at the expense of economic and social rights. And I think it's very clear that anyone who works in rights defending communities in the Arab world, even if you're in the Gulf, will have claimed and worked on economic and social rights or ideas around social justice, because that's what resonates. And yet somehow that isn't necessarily stigmatized with the Western agenda brush, in the same way that I think authoritarian leaders would always try to dismiss the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly framework as being more Western tinted.
Awesome. Thank you, Eva, for your presentation. My question has to do with a point that you made at the beginning of your talk about how you sort of feel that ensuring that the judicial system functions properly and that there's accountability for victims is sort of central to political reform and the political process in both Egypt and Tunisia and probably elsewhere. And I'm on board, and I think that's a compelling argument. But I guess I would ask, based on your presentation, it did seem like in both Egypt and Tunisia, one of the kind of core issues is that the judiciary and the prosecution system, the criminal justice system, is not working as a kind of an independent and equal kind of branch of government, if I could use that language. That there are these impediments to the judiciary, there are these roadblocks of the judiciary. functioning properly, which does seem like a political problem that needs to be resolved somehow. And maybe not, maybe it's not a political problem. So I guess one question is, is that a political problem, that the judiciary doesn't seem to be functioning independently? And if not, then how does one kind of empower prosecutors and empower investigators to act independently in a consistent and kind of, persistent way, if that makes sense?
No, it does, and you're right, because I don't think I really fully followed up on my argument or my question at the start, but I felt I was talking too much about Tunisia, so I kind of halted halfway. I mean, I think the problem is that structurally, these judiciaries, even if they are slightly more independent than other branches of government, they're still designed to sustain an authoritarian state. And I think if you look at the Egyptian Penal Code, which was exported to a lot of different Arab countries, the criminalization of insulting officials, insulting a state institution, mobilizing to overturn the regime. I mean, that's what I meant by all these political crimes. So it's designed to control and to criminalize dissent and the idea of dissent. So there's a structural problem in relying on that justice system as the tool that will then hold the executive to account. But I think that because in Egypt, and Khaled, I'd be interested in your views on this, but because in Egypt, Mubarak's rule was so defined by emergency rule and exceptionalism, the regular justice system seemed like the safer bet. And I think because you also had slightly more trust in judges over other state officials, relatively speaking. And I think if the military hadn't been I don't know how we would have made the military disappear, but if they hadn't been writing the roadmap and been in control throughout 2011, maybe judicial politics would have had a different outcome, because the bad side of looking at these trials is to show you also how prosecutors and judges felt they needed to respond to public pressure, which is not even if that's in a pro-accountability, that's not a good thing either, because you want a solid justice system, and you see that in Tunisia with the judges being really fearing the police unions. So I guess I'm not really answering your question, but what I've been trying to think about is, could we have done anything differently? And I guess the only example of differently that we have is the EVD process, but the EVD started way too late. The public hearing started in November 2016. And you've already lost the momentum that popular support that I think you have for about a year or so after a moment like these uprisings that we have. So I'm not answering your question. I'm just telling you that this is it's something that I've been reflecting about a lot. And do you start by? I suppose you could start by trying to push forward reform before you start using the system. But the problem with historic moments like the 2011 uprisings is that you have to do everything at once, immediately, and assume that the political, that history being on your side isn't going to last necessarily. And I think we didn't necessarily assume that long enough early on.
Let me reflect on this and then I'll ask a question, if I may. I'm sorry, Hussein, because it just dovetails with this. Because I remember I was very happy, I don't know whether that's the right word, but to see that we were trying Mubarak in front of a normal tribunal, rather than a military one or an exceptional or a revolutionary tribunal. I thought I had enough confidence in the legal system to believe that it can withstand this pressure. There's enormous pressure on the prosecutors and the investigators and the judges to deal with something as difficult as this, let alone as well as trying the other police officers accused of torture or shooting to kill demonstrators. And the reason is partly, I mean, my father is a judge, and so I come from this kind of, I unwittingly imbibed it, even though I was in Tahrir, I thought that somehow the institutions could deliver, and partly because I studied the history of the Egyptian judiciary, and I thought that there's enough in it that would allow judges to rely on their institutional pride and institutional memory and the functioning of it, despite the fact that I know that the laws, as you say, the Egyptian law, as Ahmed and I were talking, Egyptian laws are made to protect the state, not to protect individuals. But still, I thought, and of course the wake-up call was that same trial, when it was clear that the judge had the opportunity to ask for these logbooks and to reopen, to reclassify the Mubarak trial, and he did it. And that is how he effectively got off the book. But then I asked myself the question of what other courts could we have established, and whether the military would have allowed us to do this. At the end of the day, we have two big calamities in Egypt. We have the military and we have Saudi pressure. And this became clear in the Mubarak trial, and in a very physical way in which Mubarak appeared, when we were all waiting for him to appear behind the cage. Egyptian defendants are caged in trials. I wanted to see Mubarak behind bars. I mean, the imagery of this would have been very powerful. And instead he came on a stretcher. And the arguments I heard is that this was the Saudis and the military putting pressure on the court that no, we will not allow him to stand like any defendant pleading mercy from a judge. That theatrics will not be allowed. We will do everything possible to change it, and the result is that he appeared on a stretcher, which meant that he garnered the sympathy, and he's a sick man rather than a defendant. And that is how I lost confidence in. But again, the odds against us was Saudi Arabia and the military together, and of course Western pressure and Israel. So I don't know whether it could have done, whether we had an opportunity to do things differently. My question is different. It's kind of also about institutions, but it's about political parties and political expertise, about human rights defendants and human rights activists. I mean, so I'm going to be blunt. There is a charge that this generation, your generation, slightly younger than me, but mine as well, but anyway, the expertise that this generation of Egyptian and Arab activists put and acquired in human rights defense activism have meant that the effort that they could have put in political parties and political mobilization was diverted, and that that when the moment came for, I don't particularly buy this, but this is a charge I've heard repeatedly from not only people in Egypt but in the Arab world at large, that The movement is fragile, and there is a weak point in it precisely because the skills, as you say, the report is written by 5 people. Whereas the skills that you will do in a political party, in a mass mobilization, in activism and reaching out will be, the skills you acquire are particularly different. And that was one of the reasons why the transition you're talking about of how to make the police feel accountability, when a report would not change the balance, but a demonstration would. And the question is, how do you get people down on the streets to make this kind of pressure? When your skills are not directed to this, the skills are directed to individual work, doing research in a library, gathering information from the streets, and writing a report that would be, you know what I'm talking about. So it's an argument I'm not dismissing completely, but I don't buy as well completely, because I see the important work that. So I think to dovetail this with another question about what you said about naming and shaming as a tactic, and advocacy as an alternative tactic, but then reaching out to a wider audience, especially in moments like this now in Egypt, when people have given in and have bought the argument of stability. Whether human rights activists could have done more to change not the mindset of public officials, or not to embarrass them, but to reach out to a wider audience. And this is where Islam comes in, this is where local culture comes in, this is where, especially when it comes to something like capital punishment.
No, I think we're in agreement, Khaled, that. So I would say 2 things. First of all, in 2011 there was a little bit of a sort of everyone was kind of trying to claim to be the spark that set off the uprising, and I never had any problem. I think I started off by saying that I felt the human rights community had an agenda-setting role in terms of providing the language and very often providing some of the recommendations. But I don't think that the human rights movement, qua human rights movement, was, made 2011 happen the moment. I felt like years of human rights work had contributed to that, and that there's a huge overlap between people who were in human rights organizations and in some of the youth groups, and in some of the street protests. We're talking about the same people socially at the end of the day, but I wouldn't claim that the human rights community in Egypt and definitely not in Tunisia were social movements. And I'm actually at peace with that. I also don't think that human rights organizations in Egypt are the professionalized, the critique of. And another of the critiques of the human rights movement, overly professionalized, only about reports, very lawyerly, and that they're not political enough. And I think Egypt is a great example of how that isn't true. And I actually think, I don't know how many of you are doing PhDs, but I think human rights organizations are understudied in Egypt, partly because, I think a lot of the Middle East studies people who intended to come through town would be interested in unions. But for them, somehow human rights organizations are part of a neoliberal project or part of sort of American democratization, political science areas of study. I'm generalizing like mad, I recognize that. But these were spaces for subversive politics that survived Mubarak, that renewed themselves. You had a whole second generation of human rights organizations that were founded throughout the 2000s. That were strategic, that were hosting April 6 secret meetings in the run-up to 2011 when was needed, that were mobilizing to pull protesters out of prison when that was needed, 2008, 9, 10, 11, that were there to provide a lot of the language and the recommendations, whether it was in everything from military meetings to political talk shows to meeting with visiting foreign ministers throughout 2011. So I don't think the human rights community was kind of like clinical legal observers not attached to the politics of it. And at the same time, I don't think we need to claim in the context of Egypt that the human rights community was a social movement of itself, because they just don't have the numbers. I also think it's interesting that if you look at where, the small slithers of space that exist in Egypt today, the only institutions for dissent still standing are human rights organizations, and even that is not a short. Having said that, where I do think I'm never quite sure whether to say we or they, but I do think there was a failure not to build constituencies more actively in the post-2011 movement. I think a few organizations started thinking about this and experimenting, but I don't think that was done fast enough or with enough energy and emphasis. And I think that comes back to the needing to do everything at once. EIPR knew this, a lot of the feminist groups knew this, some of the smaller groups coming up, Fawdeya knew this in terms of the need to build a broader membership base. But the only time that could have really happened in a sustainable way was 2011-12. It's sustainable to actually build it up and strengthen it. So I do think that was a failing. Having said that, I'm not sure that would have changed the outcomes, sadly. I think it would have made us maybe a stronger movement that reflects more about appealing to the middle. But, we had our moment of stardom as human rights people, the idea of human rights people, throughout 2011, because they had a lot of media access. Human rights defenders, if you look at their Twitter following, they'd have 200,000, 300,000. They became stars, so there was a moment to a particular young generation of mass appeal that I think was never the case before, because human rights defenders were really much more on the periphery. And I think perhaps one failure is not to have really pounced on that moment and thought about how to restructure our work to become much more rooted with much bigger constituencies, and that would have actually changed the way a lot of these organizations worked.
Well, I'm sorry, Hussein, but really we are... Yes, we will have to bring this to a close. But thank you so much, Heba, for this really great presentation.
Very much.
Thank you.